Here we go. All right, so welcome everybody. Tonight's main presenter is Trixie Pacis with a presentation on videography. Then after that, Carmen will discuss this Friday night's upcoming outing, night photography in Lacombe. And then Bill will run through our images from the last assignment where the subject was emotion. Just some housekeeping notes from me before we get kicking into it. The next monthly assignment is due April the 3rd. Subject is weather. We still need names for our 3 positions on the executive: secretary, competition director, and program director. So if anybody's interested, drop us a line, or you want to nominate somebody. Nominations are open until April the 8th. And if anybody's got any questions on what the roles are or what it pertains to or anything like that, just send us an email at capsphotoclub@gmail.com or on the website, and drop a comment there on the contact us page. The AGM is coming out on April 13th. It will also be Zoom only, and we'll have a few draws for that night, but you must be in attendance to win something. And our spring competition deadline is April the 15th. Drop off at McBain Camera. Hank will be out making sales calls, so not necessarily to Hank, but they'll keep him down there anyway for us. And that's it for my quick notes. So I'll pass it over to Judy to do the introduction, and then off we go. Judy, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm really excited to have Trixie Pacis with us this evening. I'll just give you a little bit of her bio, which she has on her webpage. She is a writer, a photographer, a filmmaker, and she is drawn to the human stories, especially those exploring the connection with our environment. Trixie has set up camp in the Canadian Rockies, where she has several roles, it looks like, with several companies. Among them is being the digital media and content specialist for Paul Zika Photography. She just recently completed the Banff Centre Adventure Filmmakers Workshop. So I think we'll probably let Trixie tell you a little bit more about herself, and we'll get into the presentation. Thanks, Trixie.
Awesome. Thank you, Judy. And thank you everyone for having me join you tonight. I'm really excited to be able to talk a little bit about filmmaking, as it's something that I've been steering my career towards and really embracing. Judy gave a little bit of an introduction, but I will kick off my presentation and add to what she has started. Let me just share my screen here. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, awesome. Yep. So the presentation that I have for you this evening is an introduction to filmmaking that's geared towards photographers who are already quite familiar with using cameras and have camera gear, and want to take things in a different direction and start exploring or experimenting filmmaking. And we'll be kind of starting small and focusing on short films or short documentary style films. But I also have a background experience in narrative filmmaking. I worked in the film industry in Vancouver for a long time before moving out to Kimberly BC, where I'm located now. So I do have some insights on the screenwriting and producing sides of filmmaking as I kind of worked my way up right after university into those roles. So fresh out of university, I was an intern in Los Angeles for a group of film agents. And it was the typical running to get coffee and running errands for them. But when I moved back to Vancouver, I was able to continue in that industry and work closely with actors. And it piqued my interest in film production. So a few years after that, I ended up shifting to a different Vancouver-based company called Drive Films. And it was a small film production company with one producer, which means that I got to learn the ins and outs of making a feature film from start to finish. It was a really cool opportunity because I was able to look over his shoulder from the inception of an idea to fleshing it out into an outline and then a script, and then taking that idea and applying for financing. And then from there, pulling a crew together to film it. I got to be on set. I got to assist the camera team. I got to shoot behind the scenes. And then I got to see it all come together in the editing room and then see it on a big screen. So it was a really cool crash course on the narrative kind of filmmaking process, like the types of films that you would go see in a theater. After learning a little bit about that, I decided to go off and do a little bit of traveling, and then the pandemic happened. And during the pandemic, it was a lot harder to get large film crews together. I was living in Kimberly, and there isn't the same size film industry in Kimberly as there was back in Vancouver. So I found myself looking for something else. And I do some work as a writer, and I do some work in social media and digital marketing. But I was really missing that element of having film and filmmaking in my life. So that's when I took the BAM Center Adventure Filmmakers Workshop. Because while we don't have a huge film industry in the same way here in Kimberly, there's a lot of opportunity to get outdoors and make adventure documentaries. And the adventurous side of things, climbing, mountaineering, are things that I started to get into as I moved here as well. So it seemed like, two aspects of my life could merge together and I could explore something new. And after taking that filmmaking workshop, everything clicked. And I spent a lot of time last summer filming small projects. So short films for brands, short marketing pieces for social media, a short film, as well as a virtual concert, and started to realize that I could work in that area. So that's the direction that things have been going in for me. And I think the quickest way or the best way to kind of give you a little introduction to myself is to show you a quick, a 2-minute demo reel of things that I've filmed. I'm not 100% sure how clearly this will show through on your end. So maybe Judy, if I could start playing it, and if it's lagging or if people are having any issues, just let me know in the chat and I can just share the link and you can watch it after.
Sounds good.
Let me see if that is going to come up here for you. I think I'll have to just switch the screen that I'm sharing very quickly.
The music is breaking up, Trixie. I don't know if can you hear
No
that?
problem. So what I'll do is
I think you have to change the audio settings in your options
okay.
to include the video.
Why don't I just share this at the end or send the link to people so that they can watch it in their free time? It's not essential to what we'll be talking about or what you will learn this evening. So let me just put the presentation back on. There we go. Okay. So that's a little bit about me. And I will be gearing this presentation towards an introduction to filmmaking, so that someone who's a photographer who doesn't have maybe as much experience or doesn't have as much experience with filmmaking could step outside and make a short film and tell a short story. But if anyone has any questions about the kind of feature film side of things, we can also discuss some of those things at the end. I found transitioning from having a photography background to a filmmaking background that it definitely gave me a head start in certain areas, like a technical understanding of cameras, an eye for framing. I also found that it came with new challenges and new opportunities. So you're not just telling a story in a single instant, you're able to tell a story over a series of moving images, and you have elements like sound to help you tell your story. And you also have the opportunity and challenge to see a larger scale project through. A short film could be shot and edited in a day, or it could take a few months. And then on the other end of that spectrum, you have a feature film where I've worked on a project where from start to finish, it took 3 years. So there's a whole kind of spectrum of project sizes. And one of the fun things about a film, or one of the rewarding things, is when it's taken a lot of steps and taken a lot of work. It can be overwhelming because there are so many moving pieces involved. But what we're going to try to do tonight is break things down into 3 sections or 3 phases that you can kind of take one at a time. And then within those 3 phases, just a few key steps that you can take so that step by step you're creating a film. So we are going to start in pre-production, which is everything that happens before you start shooting. And I'll break that down into story, gear, and then the prep and logistics leading up to your shoot. So pre-production, I've heard a lot of people say this, and they say that the majority of the filmmaking process happens in pre-production. And I think what they mean by that is that the majority of the legwork and the preparation and the anticipation happens before you shoot. And then once you're there on the day shooting, things kind of just click into place, especially if you've put in the work. So a few phases to pre-production that we're going to look at are story development and whether or not you need a script, financing, if you need financing or if you can self-fund or can do the project yourself. Then there's the bulk work of the prep that includes locking down subjects and locations, shot listing and planning that side of it, and then scheduling and kind of connecting all the moving parts. I put paperwork separately because it's something that I like to do before shooting and while I'm still, excited to get everything done. And then there's gear, which could be a presentation all of its own, but we will take a look at some of the basic gear that you need and things that are helpful. So diving into story, and this is a topic that I really love because a lot of the work that I did at the film company was script development. And a lot of my job was receiving screenplays from other writers and reading through them, making an analysis and telling the producer which ones I thought were worth him reading. And of the 200 or so scripts that I read, I passed maybe 3 or 4 along and we made 1. But that's how I learned how to write screenplays, and it's part of the work that I continue to do on a freelance basis. And understanding story is such a critical first step in finishing a film that has a message. So at the very, very beginning of the filmmaking process, it's good to start thinking about the topic of your film and not just the general subject, but what it's really about or what you're really trying to say. And in filmmaking, there are a couple different ways to explain or describe your idea. And I always feel like if you can explain your idea to someone else, it means that you understand it well and that you're on track. So there is a log line, which is it's a sentence, max 2 sentences that explains who, what, and where. And it also hooks the viewer. And you've probably come across these before if you've ever looked at IMDb or back when you used to rent videos at the video store, there'd probably be a log line on the back of the DVD or VHS case or a short synopsis. But they essentially encapsulate the whole film in 1 sentence, which they can be really tricky to write, even though they're so short. So just for an example, I'll read a log line, and I'm curious to know if you can pick out which movie it is. So here's one. The aging patriarch of an organized crime dynasty transfers control of his clandestine empire to his reluctant son. Does anybody know which film that is?
Godfather?
Yeah.
Father.
Spot on. So you can see how, they kind of capture the whole film in one and distill it down into 1 sentence. And this is useful for getting funding for your film in a pitch deck. This is useful for marketing your film. But from the filmmaker's perspective, it's useful for having a clear vision of what you're trying to create. And then the big brother of the log line is the synopsis. So it's usually a paragraph to a page, and it gives you a little bit more room to explain your idea. but you also just want to stick to the core concept, the major plot points, and the, what happens to the character from start to finish, kind of what they overcome or what lessons they learn. Which is another important thing to think about right off the bat, is who are the characters in your film? What is their character arc, or what journey do they take? And what is the central conflict that they take on? And whether you're creating a documentary film or a narrative film, all of these elements are part of the story. And another thing that's part of story is plot, which put simply are the sequences of events or the cause and effect from plot point to plot point. And there are various different storytelling conventions. The diagram that you see there is a very common storytelling convention in Western stories. It breaks the story down into 3 parts, so beginning, a middle, and end, otherwise known as Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And each act, or each kind of plot piece, actually plays a role in telling the story as a whole. Each point has a specific purpose. And if you watch virtually any film or any documentary with this in mind, you'll actually be able to break down the film into each of these parts or moments. So the purpose of the first act is introduction and setup. It's where we meet the characters. It's where we get to know the location. And it transitions into Act 2 with what's called an inciting incident, or a second act turning point, it's sometimes called. But that's the moment where someone goes missing, or I'm trying to think of other examples in films, or someone realizes that they have magic. It's that moment where things change and things start to get exciting. So Act 2 is where events add up and build up into the climax. It's called rising action. And then the climax happens partway through the second act and begins to fall into the resolution. And often the third act is the shortest. They're not necessarily equal thirds, but the diagram gives you a gist of the way that, the tension rises and falls, or the excitement rises and falls in a film. And it's not that you necessarily have to stick to all of these, but it's good to be aware of the quote rules before you break them. And because so many films follow this formula, and I've read enough scripts to see that there is a formula, like down to the, a moment happening on a certain page. A lot of screenplays follow a formula. But it's good to know, because if you deviate too far without justifying it, an audience subconsciously will be aware of something being off or different. And then we talked, or I kind of listed down a script or no script. For narrative films, the script is kind of the first essential building block. But for documentaries, you might not necessarily write a script. For a short film, you might not necessarily write one. But at the very least, I suggest outlining your beginning, your middle, and your end, whether it's on paper or in your head as you're heading out to shoot something, because that'll help you get the shots that you need to have a clear beginning, middle, and end. I think I'll go through all the slides in this section before pausing for any burning questions, but feel free to jot questions down if you have them, and if we can also do a longer question session at the end. I won't talk about financing too much, because I highly recommend just going out and making a film if you're curious about making a film, and just doing it yourself. But down the road, if you do want to make bigger projects, there are many avenues for financing a film. You can self-fund, you can fundraise. There are so many grants available that will fund projects, and you can also seek out sponsorship. And if you're going to get funds or finances from another party, there are a couple documents that you'll need to prepare. One of those is a pitch deck. It's essentially a PDF document that explains your idea and why you should be the one telling that story. And it includes things like a log line and a synopsis that we talked about. It might also include things like a director's vision and a budget, which is the other document they need. And these vary from application to application, but I've included templates for them in here. And I will send this whole presentation out to you guys. So there are links throughout that you can follow later on, and you'll have this all to reference if you do decide to go make a film. You can use it as a checklist. So the first step would be creating these documents. The second step would be applying for the grants or sponsorship or fundraising. And then the third step is seeking distribution. So this is like the outlet. This would be like the CBC or the Netflix that shares your film. Sometimes having interest from a distributor will actually help you get financing or a grant. So just food for thought. Once you have a story and you're able to go out and shoot it, there's a little bit more preparation to do. Like we mentioned earlier, you need to find the right subject to film. You need to find a right location or locations. And sometimes it's worth going and scouting these locations, just like you would if you're trying to get a specific shot, so you can see what the light is doing and kind of how it moves throughout the day, and actually plan out shots before. It saves a lot of time. There's creating a shot list. And this is basically a document or a checklist for yourself that lists each shot and each transition that you need to get on the day. For small productions, it could just be an in your pocket reminder on your phone. For larger productions that shoot 30 days in a row, these shot lists can get quite detailed and quite extensive. And they also tie into the schedule because of the number of locations and the number of moving parts and different gear and equipment. So it can be very simple, or it can be very complicated. I think what's important is that, if you feel like you need a reference or a list, especially when you are in the field and shooting and trying to get everything you need before the light fades, it is nice to have something in your pocket to remind you. Then there's a schedule, which becomes relevant when you're working with multiple people. For example, you have yourself and a subject. You might be working on a bigger project where you're directing and there's a director of photography operating the camera, or you might have someone doing audio. So scheduling and kind of planning how the shoot happens is important. And then there is getting all the gear that you need. And again, like many of these things, there's a whole scale. You can make a film with, all the fancy Alexas and Aries and Sony Venice and all the kind of gear that goes with that. Or you could shoot a film on your phone. I think the most important thing is to use what you have available to you, and not let gear stop you from trying something or making something. I will take a little break from this presentation and just show some of the gear that I have. I'm a pretty small human, and I do a lot of my work in the backcountry. So it benefits me to pack light and have fewer and smaller things. I'm also a freelancer, so I can't necessarily afford all the latest and the greatest, but it doesn't really stop you from making something. So I'm shooting on the Canon, just a DSLR. It's the 90D. And I have a Manfrotto tripod. The one thing that I did invest in switching from photography to filmmaking is getting a tripod with a fluid head. And this allows you to do certain camera movements. And it's nice to have things on a tripod because the clarity and the quality and the focus is a lot better than when you're running on a trail handheld or trying to follow someone handheld. And we'll look into that a little bit more later. I just have a list here. I don't want to miss anything. Lenses. You can shoot on prime lenses or zoom lenses, and we'll get into that more later. But I have a lens here, and I have an ND filter, and these are very, very useful for filmmaking, and we'll get into why in a second. Sometimes a tripod doesn't work, and you need to stabilize things, so you can get cages and handles that go around your DSLR and still allow you to connect things like an onboard microphone. You can also get the fancy motorized ones that do the stabilizing for you. This onboard mic, I'll take the These are great for wind. Highly recommend getting a dead cat or a windshield. And then these onboard mics just capture the audio and they plug right into your DSLR. One of the biggest differences with DSLRs and cinema cameras are the inputs for audio. So you have to get a mic that's specifically made for DSLRs, but they're relatively affordable, especially for the increase in quality that you get with them. For interviews, I use a lav mic. You've probably seen these. They're just good to have in the pocket. They're good for when you're capturing audio for someone that isn't moving around. It is important when you put them in that they sit low enough that there's a vertical plane to the person's mouth. If you put them too high or if they're under clothing, they're not going to do as good a job as they would otherwise. If the person is moving, you could also get rustling. So sometimes people tape them to a specific spot. And they also make those little windshields in a miniature size, and that kind of helps soften any rustling as well. But highly recommend this if you're doing anything with seated interviews. I think that covers most of the gear. So yeah, usually if I go out for a shoot, everything fits in a bag about this big, or less, depending. I will share my screen again. Yeah, so this is just a little chart of things that are good to have. And there isn't too much on here that a photographer wouldn't already have. And there isn't too much on here that's super expensive unless you start kind of expanding the lenses or getting the ultra lightweight carbon fiber tripods or gimbals. But you certainly don't need those things to just get started. So when you have a story, the gear you need, and you've done the legwork, you've pretty much sailed through pre-production and you're ready to move into production, which is, actually getting out there and shooting your film. And I thought I'd start off with camera settings, because some of these are things you can adjust before you even get into the field. And there are a few more things to consider when you're adjusting and setting camera settings for film. You probably already have your own workflow for figuring out your settings as a photographer. And it's a similar concept with film. There's just a couple different things to add into the mix and to think about. So before even getting out on a shoot, I need to decide, or I generally decide on the resolution. I included aspect ratio in there. The standard for TV is 16:9, and that's also the standard in your DSLR if you're using one or on your phone. So you don't really have to worry about that. But there is the debate of shooting 4K or 1080p. And a lot of brands and companies that I work with insist on 4K because it's the best or one of the better qualities out there that's available on most devices. But unless your end product is going to be showing on a 4K screen, or unless you really need to crop in, 1080 works just fine, and it leaves you with file sizes that are much more manageable on the back end. And now this is a question that came up in our Banff Center Adventure Filmmakers Workshop, and we, even the professional filmmakers that shoot things for the BBC and things like that, they'll shoot 1080 if they can, if there isn't a requirement to shoot 4K. So just something to consider. Also, a lot of cameras, they don't have as many options when you're shooting 4K as shooting 1080p. So for example, on my DSLR, I can shoot at 24, 30, and 60, and 120 in frames per second in 1080, but in 4K, I only get one option. So it's a little bit limiting in that way as well. And then the other thing that I can adjust before getting out and shooting is a picture profile. And a lot of cameras come with a standard setting, but a lot of filmmakers like to use a neutral or a flat color profile when they're filming because it gives them more room and flexibility in the edit when they're color grading. So a lot of, if you have a DSLR, it likely already has a couple settings and a couple options. And for my Canon, I was able to install one, just downloading a driver off of the Canon website called CineStyle. Different makes or different cameras will also have different names for these. But if you do a quick Google, there's a lot of YouTube tutorials that are specific for your camera. Not essential, but as you kind of do more filmmaking, it's definitely something to think about. The next thing I can decide before I get in the field, or at least I can start to think about this before I get in the field, is the frame rate that I'm going to shoot at. So 24 frames per second. And this is one of the camera settings when you go into the video module of your DSLR. This isn't relevant if you're shooting on an iPhone or something else, but on your DSLR, you'll have the option to choose. And a general rule of thumb is people choose 24 frames per second if they're going for a cinematic look that has a bit of a natural blur to it. The standard for television is 30 frames per second, and it generally looks a little more crisp, a little more HD. And then you can shoot at 60 frames per second, 100 frames per second. And these are useful when you know that what you're shooting is going to be slowed down. So this is really popular for wedding videography and commercial videography and kind of YouTubers and things like that. Generally, we'll tend to shoot things with a high FPS, and then slow it down in post so that they get really smooth, slow motion. So yeah, I would choose which one you're going to use primarily before you get out in the field. And then if you know something is going to need to be slowed down and shown in slow motion, then you can change that setting before you shoot that shot. But be careful to switch back to the original frames per second that you chose for your project. And it's good to stick with 1 FPS or one main one per project. The next thing is shutter speed. And in photography, we can kind of freely adjust the shutter speed based on our needs, based on if something is moving quickly or if we need to let more light in. In filmmaking with a DSLR, you're kind of stuck with the general rule of thumb is that your shutter speed should be roughly twice your frame rate. So if you've chosen a more cinematic look with 24 frames per second, you're going to have a shutter speed of 1/50. If it's 30 frames per second, 1/60, and so on. So it kind of limits the things that you can adjust based on the amount of light or what conditions or environment you're dealing with. But definitely set that first. And sometimes I found that moving around, that gets toggled and changes. So as I'm shooting, I'm constantly checking that the shutter speed is correct before at the start of each shot, essentially. Another thing is when you start playing around with these settings in your camera, I find that it's easiest to work in video mode with the manual toggle on the top. So I always toggle this to manual and then flip to video. Aperture and ISO are the same in photography and work the same way. And if you can't adjust the ISO or the aperture enough to give you a clean histogram, that's when things like an ND filter come in. And the one that I have is a gradual ND filter. So you can kind of adjust it with just one. If you already have ND filters in there, a set of separate ones, that works just as well. Another tip is if you're shooting something with multiple cameras, it's great to match the settings on both of those cameras at the start of your shoot. And it's also great to use the same camera or the same make of camera just so that you have similar looking colors and you can cut back and forth between footage from the two cameras without giving your editor a heart attack. The next are 3 basic types of shots. So you've got your gear together, you've got your video settings worked out, and you're about to start shooting. But what do you shoot? So these 3 shots will kind of give you a starting point. Obviously, you can wing it and go with your gut. You've probably seen enough movies to have, an idea of what you want to take. But if you want to be methodical about it, think about these 3 shots. So there are establishing shots, and these are generally wide shots that show the environment and the scenery, and they kind of give context and an introduction. Then there's something that's called a master shot, and this films a scene in its entirety from start to finish. So it's usually a medium or wider shot that's showing what's happening. And then within that, you can include sequence shots. So you might get your subject to, if they were walking and entering a room and sitting down on a couch and picking up a magazine. A sequence shot would involve getting them to do that again, but positioning the camera in different places and probably tightening in on different things. So it might be their hand on the door handle when they open the door, a close up. It might be a wider shot as they're entering the room, which you can get from your master. There might be a medium shot on their reaction as on their face as they sit on the couch and it's a little uncomfortable. And there might be a super tight shot of them picking up the magazine and what's on it. So these different types of shots end up working together in the edit to tell the story. Another example is if you are baking sourdough, the master shot would be, the whole process of kneading and shaping and baking and it rising and coming out. But you can tell that story without playing all 12 hours of footage by focusing in on different aspects at different widths and kind of cutting through the master shot with little short sequence shots. So if you go, the next time you go watch a film, you can actually, a fun experiment is to list out the different shots or just pay attention to, one scene and see how many different cuts are used and what different kind of camera positions are used to show an event or a scene happening. And lenses come into play when you start planning shots because different lenses create different feelings. There's an American filmmaker named Sidney Lumet, and he says that changing lenses for the amount of information the lens gathers is only a partial use of the lens. Lenses have different feelings about them, and different lenses will tell a different story. There's lots of reading out there on which lenses certain directors love. Some directors have made entire films with one lens, and a lot of directors will mix different lenses for different parts of a film or different scenes. So on the wider end of things, and these lenses are generally used for big landscapes, tight spaces, or vlogging. Citizen Kane by Orson Welles was filmed on a 24mm lens, for example. And that allowed him to get scenes where there was something in the foreground, something in the midground, and something in the background. And all of it was orchestrated, kind of timed together. A little bit, still on the wide end of the spectrum, but a bit tighter, is the 28mm lens, for example. These are great for scenes and master shots in general. And films like the Grand Budapest Hotel were shot on a 28mm lens. A lot of commercials and documentaries are shot on a 35mm lens. It just creates a natural look and brings you a little bit closer to your subject. A lot of cinematic scenes are shot with a 40 to 50mm lens, and this kind of imitates the focal length of the eye. Quentin Tarantino is a big fan of a 40 and 50mm lens. And then once you start getting into like the 75mm and plus, you get compression, you get depth of field, and you can do artistic things. I think Munich by Steven Spielberg was largely shot on a 75mm lens. You can use zoom lenses and you can use primes. Use whatever you have available to you. If you are going to be looking for new lenses, there's pros and cons to each. So you get a little more flexibility with zooms, and they may be bulkier and heavier, but generally you can get away with having less different lenses with you. Whereas primes are generally faster, sharper, better in the light, although that's changing now. And they're lightweight, smaller, and often more affordable. Sometimes I like to plan ahead and think about what kind of shots I'm getting, and I will leave lenses behind if I don't think I'm going to need them. And Sometimes that bites you in the butt, and sometimes, most of the time, if you've done your homework and planned ahead well, it works out. And now we get into camera movements. So if you're just starting out, there's nothing wrong with locking off the camera and keeping it in one place and making a film like that. But it is really fun to start thinking about how camera movements tell stories, and different types of movements will have different effects on the viewer. So I've just listed 5 basic camera movements and kind of the effect that each one has. So there's a zoom. We use the zoom lens to push in closer to the subject. And sometimes it happens so subtly and subconsciously that the viewer won't realize that they're slowly coming in or coming out of something, but definitely keep an eye out for that as you watch films, because it's used often. There's a pan or a tilt. A pan is when you have a camera on a tripod and you go left and right, and a tilt is when you go up and down vertically rather than horizontally. These are often used to follow characters or show a location. There's the push in and the pull out. And if you've ever seen kind of behind the scenes on a film set, sometimes you see that the camera operator is sitting on a dolly, which is on a track, and a grip is pushing them forward or pulling them back. That's for a push in or a pull out shot where the camera is smoothly moving forwards or moving back. Then there's tracking shots. And this is where the camera is following a subject. A lot of the times it'll be on some kind of stabilizer, or if you've ever seen direct DPs or camera operators wearing the vest with the kind of scorpion tail that goes over their heads, and then a camera suspended on that. Those are useful for tracking shots, and those are good for showing environments or action. If you've seen 1917, there are some incredible long tracking shots that follow the main character through the war scene, and through the streets and into a field, and it's a long take, but it just kind of keeps you with someone throughout a bunch of action. And then there's a parallax shot, also known as an arc shot, which you probably see more on YouTube with YouTube creators and commercials and things like that. You don't have to use all of these in a film, but it's definitely fun to explore how moving the camera in different ways can tell your story. I know that there's a lot of information coming through, so hopefully some things stick with you. And like I said, I will give you the presentation so that you can reference all of this. If there is one thing that I want to convey, it's something that I learned in my filmmakers workshop, and that is the effect that good sound has on a film. And coming from a photography background, for me, I kept thinking about things visually. But when we watched a bunch of films back to back to back, the ones that stood out, and not in a good way, were the films with bad audio, with crackly wind and things banging and clacking in the background. And it just snapped me out of the film and the story. So if you can invest in audio equipment, highly recommend it, and do everything that you can to capture audio in the field. So if that means that a car alarm went off and interrupted your scene, try to get the person to do it again, and try to have those windshields or the dead cat for your mics if you can. Another thing is to use headphones. There's a headphone jack in your DSLR. So use headphones, plug it in and put it in one ear, and actually listen to the audio. You'll be able to hear if it's crackling, if your mic isn't plugged in right, or if it's really windy and coming through. So it's tempting to just kind of plug it in and check, but I highly recommend, especially if you're shooting an interview, monitoring the sound the whole way through, because there's nothing worse than something happening 2 minutes into a 30-minute interview, and then you've got to tell the person that you have to interview them again. It has happened once, and luckily it was Paul Ziska, and he was very, very cool about it. But I'll never let that happen again, because I made that mistake, and hopefully none of you make that mistake. That's my little bit on sound. This could also be a whole presentation of its own. But I think the main takeaway here is to just pay attention to your audio. And then I do have one quick slide on lighting to finish off the production section. So a lot of the time you'll be shooting in natural light and you'll just have one main source, which is the sun, which you can look at as your key light. It's just the main light on a subject. Can be natural or it can be artificial. If you want to take things a step further, you can set up a 2-point lighting system, which involves a key light and a fill light. A fill light will be positioned in a place that softens the shadows that are created by the main key light. And you can see in this diagram here, there's a bigger, brighter key light, and then a fill light on the other side to fill in those shadows. And you can take things a step further by turning it into a 3-point light system. And that's by putting the smallest light, a backlight, behind your subject. It'll just create a little halo on their head and create some separation between the subject and the background. Another quick thing to point out is that the eye line of the subject generally angles towards the main light. This isn't the only way to light an interview, but it's definitely a go-to for a reason. So I'll leave the slide here so that you can refer to it if you need to. I shoot a lot of things with natural light though, and that works just fine. The other thing you can do, I'll just stop this for a quick second. Another thing that's useful that I'm using right now is just having one of these lights. It's just a Lacombe panel mini. You can adjust the brightness, you can adjust the warmth, you can set it on the hot shoe of your camera. And it's just good for kind of low light situations, especially if you are following a subject and it's dark out. All right, and we're heading into the last section, but I was wondering if anyone had any burning questions before we move on to the last third of the presentation.
You mentioned using lighting, but you also use reflectors?
I generally, you can for something like a seated interview, definitely, especially if you already have some in your kit. I use mine more for kind of portrait photography, but anytime you're kind of in the field and moving around, it becomes very difficult to, unless you have a crew of people who can kind of move the reflectors accordingly. Mm-hmm. But if that's what you have and it fills the shadows, for example, on a sunny day, and you're interviewing someone outside, 100% use a reflector.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So those lens choices that you gave, they're based on full frame camera size?
Those are based on full frame. So there's a bit of math to do if you want to get the equivalent for a crop sensor. And that was kind of giving me a set of what a prime kit might look like. When I was a camera trainee on a film set, my only job for a week was running lenses back and forth to the DP and not dropping them, essentially. And they were in big metal boxes, and there were 6-7 lenses in each box. And so the job was, just he'd call out a number and you would bring that lens, and they were flying in and out of set just because they had their shot list that they were going through chronologically, and every few shots needed a different lens. But if you have a couple of zooms, like I use a 24-70, and sometimes if I bring one lens somewhere, it's just that one. It just depends on what you're shooting.
That's a fairly heavy lens too, right?
It is. So I get my workout in.
So you were mentioning earlier that you don't want heavy stuff, but I noticed you DSLR, and I saw that you got the nice big lenses there. So you thinking about going to mirrorless at some point, or?
I am, yeah. So I've been all of the kind of work-related film projects that I'm doing, and whatever I bill for equipment, or the equivalent of an equipment rental if I'm using my own equipment. I've been stashing aside so that I can upgrade. I'm looking at the Canon R5C. It's like a hybrid photography and film camera. I just wanted to see more reviews on it before pulling the trigger.
Okay, so I've got one more. I don't know if anybody else has it. I'm monopolizing the questions. So you mentioned Paul Ziska, and you're out in Banff, and you're going to do a short film on him out at some lake. He's out taking pictures out there or something. So you've got your camera bag that you showed us there. What kind of gear are you going to take just to follow him around out at some frozen lake somewhere? You're going to have only a couple of lenses, or are you going to what about gimbal? Are you going to carry your gimbals with your bag too? Or are you just going to?
It depends on where it's ending up. So if a lot of the times when I shoot stuff for Paul, it's just ending up on social media or on a YouTube channel of one of his sponsors, like Lacombe, for example.
Okay.
So I'll take a tripod, I'll take my DSLR, I'll take a wide angle zoom lens, I'll take the 24-70, I'll ditch the other stuff. I will usually take this with me, which replaces a heavy motorized gimbal. It just means that I'm squatting, ducking, crouching, and trying not to trip on rocks while I'm following him or fall into the lake myself. But these are handy. This comes off and you can get multiple attachments for them, so you can hold them different ways. And it just takes a little bit of practice. There's actually a lot of YouTube videos available that show the different stances and ways of holding these things. That gives you a little more stability.
What is that called, Trixie? What is that?
So this is it's a cage for a DSLR.
Okay.
The brand is called Nice Y Rig, Nice C Rig. The handle and the cage comes separately, okay. But your camera screws into it just like it screws into a tripod. Yeah. And then this handle is adjustable and comes off. And then there's a lot of holes on all sides so that you can modify it by attaching certain things. You can attach a light to it, you can attach a mic, you can attach a monitor. That's something that I don't bring into the field, but a lot of videographers or filmmakers like to have a separate monitor from their DSLR screen because those screens are about yay big and it's really hard to see. It's hard to have your histogram open and see what you're shooting at the same time. That's another upgrade I'll be making. And then if I'm shooting interviews, I will definitely bring this. And then I will always bring an onboard mic and not rely on the built-in mic in my DSLR. And I will have an ND filter. And this allows me to only bring one into the field and have variable settings. And that's about it. And extra memory cards and batteries.
Question along the line there with Mark. If you're shooting in a national park, do you need the permits for that?
If you're shooting anything commercially in a national park, you do need to get a permit. So if you're basically selling the end product or getting paid for what you're doing, and you have to apply about a week ahead of the shoot. So that's where a little bit of extra planning in the pre-production stage comes into play. If you're in a national park and you're just experimenting with filmmaking for yourself, I don't think that the park will fine you for filmmaking. I've never been in a situation where I've been confronted about it at a park, but I've also gone through the permitting process. It's much more expensive for a large crew, and it's definitely reasonable and affordable for a small team.
So where do they draw the line? Like if it ends up on YouTube or whatever, that could be a commercial venture or?
Yeah, I think this is more like big high paid gigs. Like if it was like a Lexus commercial or something, you would definitely need to have, and on a whole crew shooting, you would definitely need to have a permit. If it's just you making a film and you have a YouTube channel and down the road you eventually monetize your YouTube channel and you make a little bit of money, I don't think parks will come after you, but it's worth, they have some fine print on their website that's worth looking into. We kind of go by the book and just pay for the permits whenever it's a kind of work-related project.
Thank you. Another question. What do you use for editing your soundtracks? Do you do much editing on your soundtracks, or do you splice? And
I do, and I can jump into that in a couple seconds if no one else has any more questions about the prep or production phases. But really good question. We will jump into that.
okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I will dive in and then be available to answer any other questions at the end of this short section. So we're going to jump into post-production, which again could be its whole own presentation, but what I'm hoping to give is just a bit of an editing workflow, a couple of editing techniques that'll help you splice things together, and then just a quick word about what happens to your film after it's done. So if you edit photos, you probably already have a photo editing workflow, and editing a video isn't much different except for that there's a lot more steps in different programs. The first thing, which you're probably familiar with, is backing up your files. And I like to back files up twice. I also like to back them up onto hard drives directly go from memory card to hard drive number 1, and then memory card to hard drive number 2. Because if you copy from memory card to hard drive 1 and there's a mistake, and you go hard drive 1 to hard drive 2, you've just copied your mistake. And for a personal project, it's not a huge deal, but when I've been assisting the camera team on a film set, and when you lose 6 hours of filming for a big production that costs a lot, then it starts to be an issue. But it's just a good habit to get into no matter what kind of film you're making. The first step for the editing workflow is creating your rough cut. So that's basically taking all of your clips. I sometimes like to pare them down before I even bring them into the editor, which I'll show you a screenshot. I use Premiere Pro, and you can do a whole project start to finish in a program like Premiere Pro. There's no wrong or kind of right way to go about it. You can kind of go back and forth between steps, but I'll try to go through everything in like an efficient linear order, just so that you have an idea of where the process starts and ends. And also, because editing a film can be such a tedious process, it's kind of good to have steps in place. So that first step of creating your rough cut involves importing footage into your editor, organizing your footage into bins. I'll try not to toggle back and forth too much to not give anyone a headache, but just to show you, in the bottom left corner, you'll see file folder icons, and those allow me to actually organize clips into subfolders, which becomes useful when you've got 30, 40, 50, 100 clips going to one project. Once those film clips are imported, you then assemble them in a timeline. So you start dragging and dropping them into the order that you want them to appear in your film, and you also start trimming them down into the exact frames that you need for your film. And this is a step that can take a while, and it can involve rearranging things, and it can involve taking things out or adding them back in. But it's recommended to get all of the clips in the order that you want before you go ahead with any of the other steps. It just saves work and saves time, and it also keeps the file size manageable, so you're working with raw files instead of files that have a lot of additional data attached to them because they've been stabilized or color graded. So get all the clips that you want to use in your film in the right order, and that's called picture lock. And once you have picture lock, you can get into the effects. So that could be as simple as adding some transitions in between your clips. That could be stabilizing the footage. You can speed up or slow down clips, fast forward or reverse them. Once you're done that, move into coloring. On bigger projects, the editor might actually pass it off to a colorist who just excels and focuses on that aspect of editing. There's a difference between color correcting and color grading. Both are part of the coloring phase. Color correcting is fixing exposure and highlights and shadows and things like that. And then color grading is actually just focusing on the kind of color tone or the look of your film. And you can do it manually, or you can use something that's called a LUT, which is short for a lookup table. And it's basically like putting a filter on photo in Instagram. It adds a filter that's consistent to your whole film. I'll just jump back in here to show you the long colorful bars on the bottom, the long purple bar, the blue ones underneath, and the green. That makes up my timeline. So those are all the clips. You'll see the blue ones are kind of cut and spliced. Those are video clips on top and audio clips that are connected to what I recorded in the field on the bottom. The long green bar on the bottom, that's my audio, my music track. So we had a question about when you put in music and add it. It gets dragged and dropped into the timeline. Some people like to do music at the end. I often like to cut to the music. And that doesn't necessarily mean landing on every single beat, but you can listen to when the music rises or drops off, and that can help you make choices as you're splicing clips together. And then the purple bar that stretches across all of the clips that I have arranged is called an adjustment layer. It might be called something else in other programs, but whatever I add to that layer affects everything underneath it. So I've added a LUT to that, which basically colors the whole film from start to finish. And you can get LUTs for free online. Some editing programs have options built in, but you don't have to pay a colorist to color your film, and you don't have to be editing pro to play with color grading. There are dozens of editing techniques that can get very advanced, but I will just quickly go over 5 options. And if you have these in your back pocket, you could do something pretty cool with the clips that you record in the field. So there's just a plain, simple cut. It's just one clip ends sharply and immediately transitions into the next. These are kind of your default go-to. There is a dissolve, which you're probably familiar with. If you've ever used a kind of simple editing program, sometimes they're the default, or if you've kind of stitched photographs together to make a slideshow, dissolve is something you'll be familiar with. It's when one shot gradually transitions into the next. In filmmaking, a dissolve indicates that time is passing slowly. So it might be tempting to just pick one transition and pop it in between all of your clips. But each transition has a very specific meaning. And so if you've got fast action shots, but dissolves in between them, when you watch it, something will feel and look off to you. And it'll be because dissolves are generally used to show time passing. Just to jump to the opposite of that, there's something called a jump cut, which skips some of the action that you're expecting to see. And it signifies kind of jumping ahead in time. A lot of action films use jump cuts. Horror films will use jump scares. And the equivalent of that in the editing room is a jump cut. Something you'll also see very frequently in movies are J cuts and L cuts. And I have little diagrams underneath with a J and an L just to explain what they are. So where that J is, the kind of pinky purpley bar on top will be your film clip. And the green bar with the audio, black audio wave on the bottom would be the corresponding audio. And if you look from left to right, there's a little hash mark where it cuts out and turns into the next clip. So it just shows the video clip playing for longer than the audio does. The next audio track starts a bit earlier than what you see. That's called the J cut. And the L cut is the opposite, where whatever you're seeing disappears and turns into the next clip. And whatever you're hearing lingers a little bit longer before the audio of the next clip comes in. It's a little bit hard to describe in words, but if you are watching films, you'll start to notice, say you've got a character in frame who's speaking and they're continuing to talk, the visual might cut away from that person speaking to show you what they're talking about, but that person will continue to talk. That's an L cut. And sometimes in a film, you'll have, an establishing shot of a haunted house and something inside, like footsteps. You might hear footsteps before the visual switches to the mysterious figure in the hallway, and that's a J cut. And if you start looking for these in films, you'll see that they're used all the time. And then the last cut that you can play around with that's quite simple is a match cut, where 2 shots back to back have similar compositions, but they're completely different shots or different locations or different time periods. That's to kind of show a juxtaposition between things, whether it's the passing of time or the situation changing. So you don't have to use all of these cuts in every film, but they are good to have an idea of and to use kind of with intention in a project. There's also a link on the bottom of this page that has more film editing vocabulary and techniques. So if this is an aspect of filmmaking that really interests you, there's a lot of information online you can dive into, and that link underneath that says resource is one of them. And so the last slide that I want to quickly touch on is film distribution. In kind of a more Hollywood sense, film distribution looks like Netflix or the CBC or a big network having your film and releasing it. This could also be your film screening at a film festival, like the Banff Center Mountain Film Festival or the Vancouver International Mountain Film Festival. But those aren't the only ways to distribute a film. There are actually lots more ways that you can distribute your own films nowadays. There's Vimeo and YouTube. There's social media. You can share it with family and friends. I have friends that have had their films play at art galleries and museums and schools. I think the important thing is that if you make something is to share it. And there are a lot of outlets and avenues for that. And as a filmmaker, the only way that you'll get better at filmmaking is if people watch your films and are happy to share kind of their reaction or their feedback. And so that is, I guess I have one more slide. Just a few ideas that I kind of want to leave in the back of your head. One is to go into a project with a North Star or a guiding star. This might be a question, this might be what your goal is for making this film. But if you keep that in mind throughout the process, it helps you come away with something that you've made intentionally and that has a kind of clear storyline going through it. Another thing is to start watching films critically. Pick one film technique, whether it's the shots that they're using, or its story, or it's the lighting, and watch a film with that in mind and see what you can pick up or notice. You can also read. There's a lot, if you look on the internet, there's a lot of information of people critiquing films, not just giving them bad reviews, but actually critiquing the different aspects of filmmaking. And it's really fun to start digging into that. The third thing, this is something that our instructor in the Banff Center Filmmaker Workshop said, is that your job as a filmmaker is to add context to creativity. So unleash your creativity, be as creative as you can be, but make sure that there's context for the viewer to understand. Things have to be interpretable to a viewer for them to get the message that you're trying to share. Start small. Maybe you go out one day and your goal is to shoot and stitch together 5 clips, and maybe it's a whole beginning, middle, end, and it tells a story. Or maybe it's just 5 shots in a sequence, just to practice those techniques. Maybe your goal is to just have a 1-minute short film, or maybe the goal is just to document one weekend trip. But start with something that's small and contained and build up from there, and then experiment. I think a lot of filmmaking is learning from the actual practice or the act of doing it. That's how things stick. So I definitely encourage you to experiment, whether it's with a DSLR or a phone, whether it's something that's 15 seconds long and it just makes, an Instagram story or reel, or it's something short that you send to a family member or friend. Definitely have fun playing around.
So Trixie, with your phone, do you suggest, like, what about the mics on the phone? Like you say to use those other mics on your camera. What about the phone? If you were to do
You can actually get lav mics that plug into a phone. And I think you can actually get small mic kits that plug into a phone as well. You can start Googling or looking on Amazon for like kind of online content creator kits, and they'll actually come up with a bunch of things that are sized and are made for cell phone videography. It's kind of crazy what's available now.
Yeah.
Or come see me at McBain Camera.
Oh, yes.
Go say hey.
Not a plug at all, okay.
No endorsement at all.
I might come knock on your door, Hank.
So what was the program you used to stitch it together, post-production? Okay.
I use Adobe Premiere Pro.
Premiere Pro, okay.
And there's a subscription, like there's a photo video subscription that just comes with Lightroom, Photoshop, Bridge, and Premiere. So that's I was already using Photoshop and Lightroom, so it just was a natural kind of direction to go in.
So then I probably have it.
You probably have it. There's also, if you're making a film on your phone, there's a lot of phone editing apps. There's one called Splice. And I think there's a free trial available, and it comes with its own music options as well. You can add titles, you can add transitions, all of that stuff. So if you want to do something, start small and start on a phone, you can shoot on a phone and use a phone app to edit.
Cool.
So is it preferable to, if you're shooting off your DSLR, to shoot in log and edit that way? Which I assume log is similar to what raw would be for photography, right?
Log, flat, CineStyle, those are different cameras have different names for it, but it is the equivalent of shooting raw. It just gives you a lot more flexibility. I think you have to decide if you want that extra work on the editing phase, because usually when you shoot log or CineStyle or flat, you have a little bit of work to do in terms of, at the very least, adding a LUT or manually kind of adding vibrance and saturation. It also depends on, if the lighting is nice, shooting in the standard profile might work out. If it's a really bright, glary day, then definitely recommend trying the log setting.
You talked a bit about background music. Do you have a royalty-free website that you go to and that you prefer?
I have a Music Find subscription. I hear a lot of good things about Artlist. I think some of them have free trials. Generally, it's better to get the subscription than to pay for an individual song, from what I've seen. So, maybe you just time it so that you're downloading music for your projects 1 month. But definitely recommend going the official license-free music route versus pulling music, especially because now if you're posting it on social media, they can tell if the music's been taken from somewhere or if you have the rights to it. And so you'll deal with things like they won't post your video.
So at the end of your film, then, when you've gone and you've taken the royalty-free music, do you still have to give credit to whoever the artist was and everything like that on there, even though it was royalty-free?
I usually do when you download a song, it comes with a contract or an agreement. And I think the agreement stipulates that you will show credit where possible. So I think there's always an argument to be made. But I think just as an artist, it's just nice to give other artists a little shout out, even if it's, you know, a quick frame at the end of your film that has credits in it, or if it's just in the description of the video when you post it to Vimeo or YouTube, or a little tag when you're sharing it on social. I like to play it.
Well, that's all the questions I've got. I had a lot tonight. Sign of a good presentation, I guess, when I've had a lot of questions.
Thank you. I hope that that was helpful, and I hope that it encourages some of you to go capture some moving images.
It is a bit overwhelming, but I think, like you say, if you just take it small step at a time, it might be kind of exciting to do something like that. Yeah. Thank you, Trixie.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening to me drone on for an hour.
No, thanks for joining us. That was excellent. Thank you. And if you send those links along to Judy or to the Camera Club, then I will send them out with our email tomorrow when we post this.
Perfect. I definitely will.
Excellent.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your meeting and have a great night.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so Carmen's up to give us a rundown of the Friday night night shoot there. And Lacombe. Been a long
Just
day.
a reminder to everyone that our urban night outing is on Friday, just in case you haven't been checking your emails. So we are going to Lacombe for something different, and also because a lot of people have said they're not super comfortable in downtown Red Deer. Not sure what we'll find, but there will be lights. And so we'll just have some fun. We're meeting. If you would like to carpool, please meet us at the Tim Hortons on 67th, just in that parking lot between the Tim Hortons and whatever hotel it is there. I do have a list of people who have replied and want to come. Not everyone specified if they will be meeting in Red Deer or just meeting in Lacombe. So the meeting time in Red Deer is 6:45. If you're not there to jump in someone else's vehicle and try to pack the vehicles and save on gas, then we will meet up with you in Lacombe. And our meeting place in Lacombe is at the Lacombe Memorial Center. Big parking lot there. I will also send out an email to everyone who has replied to say that they are coming. But the more the merrier. So if you haven't replied yet and are interested in coming out, please join us. If you didn't get to see Chris Attrell's presentation from a few weeks ago, a month ago maybe, do have another look or listen on the YouTube channel, because he had some really great information, especially for people who are new to night photography. And that's it, unless anyone has any questions about that.
Silence.
Silence.
All right, I guess not. So look forward to seeing you out there in Lacombe.
Yeah, I'll also add that, you know, we do plan on staying in some pretty tight groups there, just for everyone's safety, and so that we can enjoy the social outing and help each other out and share ideas and suggestions as well.
Excellent. All right, Bill, you're up with the images from our last assignment.
Okay, I'm just going to try and find my my screen here. Hang on. What's the assignments? Where are we? I'm trying to find my assignment, and there we are. View. I'm assuming everybody can see the splash screen.
Yeah,
You are assuming correct, yeah.
Oh, excellent. All right. All right, this month we had a slight drop in submissions, but that's fine. This month was emotion. So without any further ado, here we go. Feel free to make any comments, ask any questions. Well, there's a real pouty face. Yeah, the laughing cow.
What are you looking at?
Yeah.
Can
That's a
you say
great
who
job.
submitted them?
What's that, Curtis?
Can you say who submitted them?
I could, but I don't have the list in front of me right now.
Okay, something to think of for next time.
I could, thank you. Swanky ride. Oops.
I think that's my jet.
And who doesn't like a hug from grandma? You know, with a face like that, I was expecting to see something broken or a big pile of mess on the floor.
Actually, that's at the, he was at the gym, and I wanted some more gym equipment in the background, but unfortunately, the only time he came running at me was with just that big thing there behind him. So, but I was trying to show that he was at the gym, and he was all excited that he's running around.
Good job.
Yeah, nice capture. Yeah, who doesn't like a puppy? Good focus on the eye.
Thank you.
And a bit of a mix of emotions there.
Yeah.
Nice yellow in the shoreline there, and burnt out trees in the background or midground. And there we are. That's it. Whoever made a suggestion about photographer, thank you for that. I'll add that as a text on the bottom of the presentation for next time. So thank you for that.
I think there was some other pictures because mine wasn't showing, but that's okay. I don't mind it, but I think there were some other ones as well. Wasn't there?
We only had 13. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7.
Oh, sorry. I somehow I missed some of these.
Oh,
Okay. We went from the horse to the
from the horse to the present.
water, didn't we? Or did I
No,
miss?
it was there. You were just sleeping at the
Oh
time,
my
Judy.
God, where was I? Sorry, I looked away for a moment and there I was. Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry about that, Bill.
that's okay. That's all right. Nice pictures though. So I'll attach the photographer's name as text next time. Thank you for the suggestion. As Mark mentioned previously, the next assignment is due on the first Sunday in April. I think it's the second or third. I can't remember which one that is. And the subject is weather. So it can either be the primary subject, like a lightning storm or lightning strike, you know, or swirl of snow, I guess, or it can be used to set the mood of the picture. So use your imagination. We have weather all the time.
Whether we like it or not.
Whether we like it or not. Yes, we do. Thank you. Okay, Mark, back to you.
All right. Thank you, Bill. And so that will conclude tonight's meeting. And just a reminder, we do have the AGM coming up, and and of course the Friday outing. The other clubs are still offering us all of the presentations that they have coming up. So I think Judy's got quite a few lined up there. I know there's a few in April that she's got messages for. So There's still lots on the way before we break up for the summer break anyway. So
big shout out to Judy for arranging all the talks and presentations. So
yeah, excellent work.
there's a lot. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Woo.
All right, everybody have a great night. Judy, did you want to say something?
You're welcome.
Okay. All right, everybody. Have a good night.
You too.